Hello and welcome everybody. This is a Forbes Solicitors Construction Sector live Q&A session. It's in conjunction also with experts from MHA Moore and Smalley. If I can just say welcome to all the attendees and a welcome in advance to anybody else who joins during the call. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to all the expert panelists that we have with us as well, who will get introduced as we go along. Format wise, just to let you know who I am if you're not already aware, my name's Adam Bromley. I'm a partner at Forbes Solicitors and I'm the head of property and the construction sector group. I will be coordinating this session as well as I can. If you've got any questions that you would like to ask as we go along, there is a Q&A function. Just please raise the question and I will direct it to the appropriate panelists as we go along. We do have some questions that have been sent in advance, so I'll get us started with those and we'll throw them to the relevant people. But we want to make this as interactive as we possibly can. So if you do have any burning questions that you've been dying to ask, then please ask them as soon as you would like. If, as we're going along, there's a topic that takes your fancy that you want to talk about in a bit more detail, please ask. If you want to ask a specific question arising anything that anybody is talking about, whatever anybody wants to do, as I say, just use the Q&A function and I will direct the questions as appropriate to the relevant panelist. To get us started off, we have first of all had a question sent in for one of our partners in our insurance department, David Mayer. David, we've had a question asking about workers returning to site and how people can maintain social distancing when some of the activities that they'll be carrying out just don't allow them to do that. And should there be perhaps any testing being carried out with thermometers, for example?
Right, thanks Adam. Morning everybody, thanks for joining us. I'm assuming you can hear me. Just send me an abusive message in the chat function if you can't. But I mean, yeah, as far as that question goes, I mean, the first thing to remember is that social distancing is advisory, not mandatory. So the government's recognised for quite some time now that there's just some activities that just don't lend themselves to social distancing on construction sites, particularly. Installing plasterboard roofs or working in confined spaces, for example, it usually involves some kind of proximity working with two or more people. So it's okay to be to not be socially distant, but the crucial part of it is being able to justify that risk where there is one. So, I mean, it's important to remember there's an inherent risk of contracting or transporting the virus under most circumstances. I mean, your employees could pick that up on their clothes, stopping at a supermarket on the way to work, for instance. And the risk of complications with from COVID from a healthy adult is relatively small. So, although it needs to be considered, it also needs to be balanced with more traditional risks. Construction sites still see one of the biggest proportion of fatalities and serious injuries in the HSE statistics. So it's a case of balancing that risk, and there are many cases when it'll simply just be safer to be in close proximity to other workers and risk infection than to keep people apart, maybe because of manual handling risks or additional burdens and that kind of thing. So as long as you follow a standard risk assessment process, it shouldn't really be much of an issue. So you need to be asking whether people should be on site at all, which sounds a pretty obvious question, but it's not always necessary for everybody to be on site at the same time. Assuming they do, then obviously you need to dig down a little bit into the task and see whether anything can be done to keep people socially distant. So can they be automated? Can lifting equipment be supplied? You reduce the number of people needed to do it. And then if it can't be mechanized, then there's various kind of guidelines on how you can try and minimize the risk. So working back to back, carrying out part of the process in isolation before someone else arrives to do another bit afterwards, working in smaller teams without rotating and minimizing the number of people that you come into contact with. And then obviously all staff need to be told that they shouldn't be on site at all with any kind of viral symptoms of any description. As it stands, the body temperature question, body temperature isn't currently thought to be a particularly reliable indicator of an infection, and that of course doesn't actually deal with transporting it on new person when you're not infected anyway. So testing on a construction site is really going to be a fairly limited use. I can see some quite niche circumstances, particularly in manufacturing more than anything else, where you've got very strictly controlled environmental conditions with stringent other measures, where perhaps temperature testing on top is a belt and braces approach. But working outside, particularly on construction sites, I think on most occasions thermometer testing isn't going to be of any great assistance.
Thanks, David. I think that covers that question comprehensively. Thank you. You touched on employees, and that's led to a follow-up question that's been sent in that will be best directed towards one of the other partners at Forbes and our head of commercial employment, Emma Swan. Emma, we've had a specific employment-related question sent in as well. This is asking, what do we do if an employee is refusing to return to the workplace and says they don't feel safe from COVID-19?
Thank you, Adam. Good morning, everybody. The first thing that you've got to try and establish is whether this is a legitimate concern from an employee, because if it is someone who is genuinely concerned about their health and safety, and that's why they're not wanting to come back into work, then they would potentially get a protection from an unfair dismissal if you were to discipline them and then lead to dismissal if they were still refusing to come in. So the key tip that we've shared with a number of clients is communication. So if someone is expressing concerns, make sure that you sit down with them, whether it's via Zoom or if they are coming into an office environment rather than to the construction site. Can you talk to them about what they are concerned about, why they are concerned about it? Now, you will have carried out risk assessments, so hopefully you will have got those written down, because you should have got them written down, and you can then get them to read those. You can send that to them at home via email if they want to read it before speaking to you about it. And you're going to need to try and find out from them what aspects of it they are concerned about, so that you can then address them. If you already have done, you can point them to the right part of the risk assessment. But this is about making sure that line managers understand employees, because everybody during this pandemic will have had very different experiences. So some may have been poorly, or known people have been poorly, who've suffered bereavements. There may be people who have shielded themselves, been living with people who are shielding. So the concerns that people have, particularly where they are genuine, will be very specific to that individual, and line managers need to be told that they need to be sympathetic and they need to try and understand what is the problem. One of the ideas that has worked with some clients where people have been genuinely concerned is they've sent out the risk assessment, they've then held a conversation with the individual, and then they've actually agreed for the individual to go on site to have effectively a tour, so that they can see how other people are following the rules. They have also been reassured that if people are refusing to follow the rules or are jeopardising their colleagues' health and safety, that disciplinary action can be taken and will be taken by employers, so that they are more reassured that if someone starts coming towards them and breaching some of those rules around social distancing or not wearing the correct PPE, etc., they feel safe in what we call blowing the whistle, whistleblowing, making a protected disclosure that they are concerned that their colleagues are not following the rules. And if employers are also communicating that they are steps that they're prepared to go through, then employees are more likely to come back. The third thing that we've encouraged people to do, if people are still worrying, is see if you can agree a bit of a trial return to work, so that they can come in and actually see how comfortable they feel over the period of, say, a week. And if they're still then struggling, then you can talk to them again and see where they are struggling. If you still have someone who's still refusing, You can go down the course of disciplinary action, potentially leading to dismissal, but it will very much depend on what evidence you may have been able to build up during the communication process that they are not genuine and they're basically just taking the mickey and want to stay at home and get paid or kept on furlough for doing nothing. Or if it's somebody who is unreasonably refusing to come back to work because even though they may have genuine concerns, you can demonstrate that you have done everything you possibly can and they are still refusing to come back, then you would still, in those circumstances, be justified in disciplining them. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you very much, Emma. I know that employment law has been very fast moving and employee issues have been at the forefront of everybody's minds. So thank you for that. And as I say, we'll keep an eye out for any further questions coming in of an employment related variety. That probably leads in quite nicely to the next question that's been sent in. It's not just employee issues that are causing problems. COVID has contributed to a number of issues in relation to projects being carried out. And this is a question that's come in for Lucy Bailey, a solicitor in our dispute resolution department. Lucy, we've been asked that COVID has meant that we are significantly behind on a project, and meeting practical completion is more and more unlikely due to things such as lack of supplies, site health and safety restrictions, meaning that jobs can't be completed, some of which are on a critical path. The question asks, what are the implications of this, and what are some of the options available?
Thanks, Adam. Morning, everyone. I think it's a really interesting question and one we are encountering a lot at the moment here at Forbes. Delay is one of the most frequent issues for construction projects before COVID, and especially is the case now. I understand it's very frustrating, especially when these events are outside of your control. So we can help you to effectively manage your contracts going forward and try and minimise the impact of this delay. So turning to the question of impacts first, I think there are three main impacts for contractors at the moment as a result of delay. The first of these is liquidated damages. So are there any liquidated damages provisions within your contracts? What are the level of these liquidated damages? And have you considered these and factored these into your cash flow moving forward? The second question really, and the second impact is termination. Can the employer terminate your contract for delays? Ordinarily, delays to practical completion isn't a repudiatory breach of contract. That is, unless time is of the essence in the contract or time is made of the essence. So I think it's worthwhile thinking, are there any other provisions in the contract that the employer can terminate for? So one of these that is common across construction contracts is the ability to terminate if the works are suspended for a significant period of time, and that's an agreed period of time within the contract. If that's the case, then either party can actually terminate for that event, and often within the contracts, one of these events is a force majeure event, which is likely that COVID-19 is a force majeure event, or alternatively, if because of the government suspending works across the board, if that is the case, it may be because of statutory law. So one of the questions really to think about is, if the employer terminates, what impact is that going to have on you in the short term for your cash flow, but then also long term for potentially you may have a pipeline of work with this employer, and it may affect your ability to work with them moving forward. So that leads into the next part really. One impact is damaged reputation and also affecting business relationships going forward. So that's a massive implication to think about. So how do you minimise this, and what are your options going forward? Our advice has really been that the first point of call is to try and open up some dialogue between you, the employer, and any other significant party under the contract. That really is the best approach, because entering into these negotiations may enable you to agree between yourselves to vary the terms of the contract, or it may just lead to a resolution. Everyone is likely to be in the same boat at the moment, so it's important to work together. And actually, under unamended JCT, there is an optional supplemental provision for collaborative working. So it's really important to understand whether that is actually turned on and that is effective on your contract. You need to bear that in mind. There's also some guidance from the Construction Leadership Council that the approach should be taken across the sector is to act reasonably fairly and take a collaborative approach, with the aim that it will minimise the impact for the industry as a whole and also the economy. So the next thing to do, if that's not successful, is to give notice and seek an extension of time. So in an unamended JCT, you are obliged to give notice when it becomes reasonably apparent that the completion date is going to be affected. Likewise, under an NEC, there is an obligation to give an earliest notification when the works are going to be significantly impacted. It's all about an early warning system. So in terms of these notices, I've got 3 takeaways really in terms of when you need to give them and what you need to do. So the first thing really is to make sure the notice given is in the appropriate form, it's in writing, and also it's given within the required timescales. The second thing I would say is don't delay. Give the notices, again, open up those dialogues as soon as possible to avoid any instances, and you are more likely to be granted those extensions of time. In terms of a JCT, when you're requesting an extension of time, if it is as a result of a relevant event, so again, a force majeure event, then the employer has to consider the request and it ought not to be reasonably refused. So it is really important to try and make use of these tools. The third thing I would say in respect of the notices is keep thorough and detailed records. I can't emphasize that anymore, because that's your important, that's the background really for you to evidence that you have been affected by COVID-19 or indeed in any other circumstances, and you can evidence what the impact of that has been. Keep records of any meetings or telephone conversations with any affected party within the agreement. And the third thing really is you've got an obligation and a duty to take measures to minimise the impact of delay. So I would be saying be proactive in that approach, have conversations with your suppliers, ensure that they can meet demand as well, because it's not just you. If you've got suppliers or subcontractors, what knock-on impact is delay at their end going to cause you? So really think about that. And the fourth thing really that I would be saying is know what your contract says, really understand what your obligations are and your rights under the contract. And that is the most important thing. Take advice at an early stage and see what your obligations are. So if you've got any more questions along those lines, then please feel free to drop me a message in the chat or drop me an email at the end.
Perfect. Thanks, Lucy. That was really comprehensive. Thank you very much. We've had another question come in live, and this mentions the words contracts and the dreaded P word, procurement. And very fortunately, we have Daniel Milnes from Forbes Solicitors with us today, a partner and the head of the Governance, Procurement and Information Department. Dan, we've been asked what sort of lessons could be learned moving forward for construction, procurement and contracts arising out of the COVID experience. Is that something you could cover for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Adam. It's certainly been something that we've been advising a number of clients on alongside Lucy's team. And I think probably where I'll start is where she left off, which is it's vitally important to understand what is in your contract and what your rights are. And from the point of view of a procurement lawyer, it's too late if you're looking at the contract now. As procurement lawyers are famous for saying, you really need to have thought about this 6 to 9 months ago when you put the contract together or you set up the framework. It's not a question of finding out what's in the contract. It's a question of putting what you want into the contract at the very outset of the process in order that you already know what your rights are. You don't have to take any nonsense from the other side. And it's as clear as it can be upfront who's got what responsibility and how it's going to work. It's fair to say the 3 things we've learned are firstly that the authors of the JCT and NEC contracts didn't see COVID-19 coming any more than anybody else did. As Lucy said, quite rightly, the debate often is this a force majeure event? Is this instead the works being affected by the exercise of statutory powers because depending on which of those two it is, the outcome under a normal JCT may very well be different. One of those might affect the price that the employer has to pay, one might not. So that's more up in the air than potentially you would want it to be in future. We've certainly had a couple of clients already instruct us to prepare JCT amendments to cover off anything like this happening again, not only the prospect of a second wave, but the prospect of whatever the next thing might be that comes up in a few years' time. The second thing is that you do get what you contract for. So decide if you want the standard version of finger pointing, blame, and ultimately somebody wanting to terminate the contract. You can set your contract up to achieve that, and that's very easy to do. The slightly more difficult version is to figure out how the risk and the cost should be allocated if there is this kind of disruption to a project, and possibly understand, is there a tolerance in the budget? Might the employee be prepared to pay a little bit more if the circumstances dictate? And try to agree in advance what that solution might look like. At least then, you're not starting with a blank page if the worst comes to the worst. The third thing quickly is that if you're contracting in the public sector, public procurement through the public contracts regulations has been used as a mechanism for government intervention in response to the COVID outbreak. Procurement Policy Notices 1 and 2 of 2020 specifically require contracting authorities, so that's public sector buyers, to consider if they have a vulnerable supplier to carry on making payments under the contract even if the service or goods are not being delivered, in order to maintain the capacity in the supply chain for when it's possible to start performing the contract again. Public bodies have been specifically instructed by the government to think very carefully before pulling the rug from under a contractor using a force majeure clause or delivery timing on KPIs, project milestones, that kind of thing. So public bodies are being asked to consider their responsibilities towards contractors by making temporary amendments to contracts. And as all procurement fans out there will know, that engages Regulation 72 of the PCR, which is the extent to which you can amend an existing contract before the law says you started afresh. So that's something that we are looking at with a number of clients at the moment. What can we change in the short term? And certainly at this stage, what does the short term even look like and how long is it? So those are questions that we're grappling with, and we'd certainly welcome anybody who's got any more questions or ideally some contracts for us to work on.
That's perfect. Thanks for that, Dan. That really covered everything off. And we have had a wide ranging variety of questions coming in, and we've covered quite a lot of the legal related questions that have come into us here at Forbes Solicitors. But as I mentioned, we do have a couple of experts on the panel from MHA, Moore and Smalley, and I think the time has come to throw a few questions their way. So I will first of all just say hello and welcome to Joe Sullivan and to David Hackett. Joe's a partner at MHA, Moore and Smalley, and David is a director, both specialising in construction and tax related issues. So we've had a couple of financial accountancy type questions sent in. So Joe, I've got the first one to throw to you if that's okay. We've had somebody ask what sort of things can companies do within the construction sector to maybe accelerate the cash coming in or to mitigate the cash going out? Okay,
thanks Adam. Hi everyone. I think I'd be tempted to start at the beginning with the easy stuff, which is actually, are we making use of all the government assistance that we've seen in the headlines? Okay, so we've got the furlough scheme. We're now into July, we can move into flexible working patterns. So again, getting our claims in nice and early so we get the cash back in a timely manner. There's the bounce back loans, which are at the smaller end of the scale for larger entities. Up to 45 million, you can look at the civils loan scheme. There you can get an overdraft facility or indeed term debt of up to £5 million. Health warning there, I'd probably suggest, is that's scheduled to end in September, so you kind of want to be getting applications moving with your bank partner now. I think secondly, again, just moving that on, you'd look at things like time to pay, where you've got existing tax liabilities and you may be struggling to meet that cash outflow. So again, a time to pay arrangement, call up HMRC and agree on a case-by-case basis a mechanism to pay that liability over a longer deferred period. I think moving more into this sector, I think in the clamour to take advantage of the Companies House 3-month accounts filing extension, people are overlooking that in order to make a claim for a tax relief, you need a set of accounts. If you're extending your accounting period end, you're actually deferring that, you're making that potential further away. So again, I would actually argue, look at what tax reliefs are available to you, and is it worth actually shortening your accounting period end, okay? And bringing forward the point at which you could make a claim for a tax relief. I suppose an example would be a lot of people have taken advantage in March and April over the VAT deferral, whereby you can defer paying your VAT for 12 months up to the end of March 2021. Again, imagine you had a March 21 year end. You could actually shorten that, say, to December 20, if you knew you had a claim for a decent amount of R&D or land remediation relief. Make that claim and potentially access a cash repayment to set against or help mitigate the VAT repayment that you have looming in March 21. I think looking at the construction sector in particular, what sort of tax reliefs are available. I mentioned land remediation relief. So again, that is open to, unfortunately, that's just corporate vehicles. And that is where the costs of remediating the effects of Japanese knotweed, chemicals, that sort of stuff, you can get up to 150% of those eligible costs as a deduction against your profits. And indeed, if that does create what's called a taxable loss, you can surrender that for a cash reclaim. There's also R&D, research and development tax credits. Again, that is incredibly generous for a small enterprise. That's up to 230% of eligible costs. Again, that is where there is a technical or scientific uncertainty. So here at Moore & Smalley, we've seen that sort of applied where we have construction techniques used on listed buildings. We've also seen examples whereby humble trace heating has been used to sort of ward off condensation in really large scale construction contracts. So there's plenty to go at. And again, there, if you create a taxable loss, you can surrender for a cash reclaim. I think very finally, capital allowances, again, this is predominantly with commercial property, but again, that's open to both corporate and unincorporated vehicles. There's plenty to go at in terms of capital allowances, both now on structured buildings allowances. You've got enhanced capital allowances, which ended 31st of March, in respect of energy saving equipment. But I think the thing I would flag up here is, again, be careful where you are selling a commercial property. Look back, have we taken advantage of all capital allowances that we should? And again, talk to your solicitors. I know, Adam, your team are keenly aware of that. And also just more generally in any tax reclaim, you have a 2-year window from the end of the accounting period. So again, not only consider the current period, but also those that have passed recently. Make sure you're really utilising everything you can. Okay.
Thank you very much, Joe. There has been another question sent in that is for yourself and David, but I'll maybe throw this one to David after you've just finished. So thank you very much. David, we've also been asked, for those concerned over the performance of certain income streams, or maybe even the entity itself, and what sort of options are available to protect unencumbered assets, such as property, cash, key contracts and the like.
Thanks, Adam. Morning, everyone. Yeah, I mean, the answer is there are plenty of things you can do here. And actually, they're quite prudent things to do. That I know kind of the question is at the forefront of everyone's mind because of the current situation, but thinking about what valuable assets you've got within your business is something you should always be reviewing, and protecting those assets is prudent. So we look at doing this with clients all times of the year, not just against the backdrop of COVID-19. I think typically what we would see is that this would apply to assets such as property, whether or not it's got bank debt on it. But I guess there needs to be a certain amount of equity in that property before you consider whether or not it needs to be in a separate structure to protect that equity. We also see it in the context of surplus cash. So perhaps the company's been trading really well and built up significant cash reserves over a number of years that is over and above what's required in the trade. So they could comfortably move some of that cash out without impacting on working capital requirements. I think just in the context of debt and assets being unencumbered, I think it's important to say that what we're talking about here is protection against unsecured creditors and maybe an uninsured claim. I think if the bank does have a charge on your assets, the fact that you move them out into another company wouldn't get you away from that kind of charge. That would always be recovered from the bank in some way. They'll make sure that when you create a different structure, that their debt is protected, if you like. So the main way that we would look at doing this is to create a holding company for a trading company. So we'd have a share-for-share exchange, and we'd have a new holding company that owns 100% of the trading company, and then your individual shareholders own shares in the holding company. And if we used a property as an example, we would transfer a property from a trading company into a holding company and initially leave that debt between the two companies on loan accounts. So the asset would be transferred at market value, and you'd be left with a debt, i.e. the holding company owing the trading company for the value of that asset. And then at that point, you haven't actually ring-fenced anything. So the next step is crucial and actually sometimes gets overlooked, because if you leave that intercompany balance in play and the trading company subsequently gets into difficulty, then a liquidator could call in that debt. It would force the holding company to sell the property and then repay the trading company for that debt. So the way that we deal with this is to declare a dividend from the trading company to the holding company. Now, if the trading company has got significant reserves, then you can do that virtually on the same day as the transfer, and it can all be done in one go. But what you've got to be mindful of is a dividend will reduce the net asset value of your trading company. So if you're filing accounts at Companies House and it suddenly shows as a dip in the net assets of say £1 million, then in the public eye, that doesn't look too great. So there might be a 2 to 3 year plan to sort of stagger dividends in order to manage the impact on the balance sheet and just make that credit rating value as good as it possibly can be when it comes to filing accounts at Companies House. So that final step is a key stage and something that does often get overlooked. If you didn't want to go with a holding company, you could have property in a completely separate company that's standalone to your trading company, so they're not within a group. You could consider personal ownership, although taking property out of the company into personal ownership often has the most tax consequences. And another alternative might be to use a pension wrapper. So you might be able to transfer your property assets into a pension. You might be able to transfer surplus cash into a pension by making additional pension contributions. All of these transactions have tax consequences, so you need to consider before you do anything, well, what are the tax implications? Is there any tax leakage? Typically with a holding company, because those two entities, the trading company and the holding company, are in the same group, you can affect that transaction without any tax cost to either company. And the others have their own tax consequences as well. What we've seen more recently with COVID-19 is perhaps you've got two trades within one company, and their fortunes are differing. Maybe one isn't as impacted as from COVID-19 as another. And maybe it's a time to think about, well, do we separate those trades out so that the one that's flourishing can continue to flourish and it's not having to prop up the other trade? And we'd look at doing that by way of a demerger. So we'd end up with effectively two trading companies that are completely separate, standalone, but with identical shareholders. Or maybe there's even a dispute between shareholders about how they see the business going forward and how to deal with the impact of COVID-19. So you might use a demerger for one set of shareholders to take one trade in a particular direction and the other set of shareholders to go in the other direction. So there's a number of things you can do round demergers to make sure you're protected. And that might even include where you've got let's say a significant property portfolio alongside your trading activities, and you now think it's a time to, rather than just go to a holding company, let's completely move them apart so that we have one investment business and we have a trading business. I think in the context of the construction sector as well, using sort of special purpose vehicles for particular contracts. Perhaps there's a development that you're looking to do that has particular risks against it's highly geared, things like that. Then you could think about using a sort of separate subsidiary company, a standalone company from that for that particular project that ring fences against all the other activities that you're carrying on as a business.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. That covered a number of scenarios. I think that'll been very, very useful to people and what they're thinking about. So thank you very much to you. Thank you very much to Joe for covering those questions off. We have had a question come in that I think is best directed back to you, Dan Milnes, if that's okay. The question that's come in is referring to saying that some contractors are refusing to attend to defects in tenanted properties, stating it is against current guidelines, and there's a difference in what the MHCLG and CLC are stating, and the question asks which takes the precedent. Is that something you could cover, please, Dan?
I can, and this might be something that it might be better to pick up some aspects of it with our questioner after the webinar, because I suspect there may be some confidential contractual elements to this that we need to get into. I mean, question one would be, very much depends what the contract says. If there is legitimate scope in the contract for the provider not to provide that service in these circumstances, then it may be very difficult to compel them to do it if the contract lets them off the hook. That said, if the contract lets them off the hook, they oughtn't to complain too much if you go and find another provider who is prepared to sort those defects out. And I think contractor number one might have to understand it wouldn't get paid for that work because somebody else was. The other issue is that MHCLG and the CLC have a very different makeup. I've just been looking at the membership of the CLC as knowing this question was coming in, and it is very much construction sector, whereas MHCLG will be looking at it from the tenancy side of things. And certainly if we're in registered provider housing association territory, the home standard still applies. It's critical that anything relating to the health and safety of tenants gets taken care of. COVID doesn't affect your Section 11 landlord and tenant obligations in relation to looking after the structure and exterior of the other key facilities in the property. So my understanding of this would be that there's a legitimate requirement on the landlord to get those things sorted out in a tenanted property. And the question then is, what's the best method of getting that done? I'd certainly advocate discussing it with the contractor to see if a working method can be found before triggering any kind of termination or confrontational approach to it. And consider also that in the capacity of a landlord, possibly you can exert a little bit of influence over the tenant to make life easier. If it's a significant piece of work, then potentially decant the tenant for 72 hours and then let the contractor have what amounts to a clean building to go and work in, and then put the tenant back in afterwards. So there's a range of options. It does depend on the severity of the problems and what the contract says. So probably as far as we can go for now.
The only thing I'd add, Dan, just to that, I think, is echoing everything you've said, but just reiterating what I said previously is, I think with this, I think you need to definitely make sure you've got updated records. You keep these records, and you have a full evidence bank of exactly what issues you've been experiencing with the contractor, what meetings you've had, what conversations you've had, and I think that helps us in the long run if there are any further issues. But that's just one additional tip, is just make sure you write everything down, really.
Thanks, great advice from both Lucy and Dan there. Thanks for covering those off, and hopefully that answers the question. But if anybody has any follow-ups or wants any further guidance on that point, please ask the question. I do have a question that's come in, that's one for Jen Hankinson. Jen is one of the partners at Forbes and heads up our housing and regeneration property team. Jen specialises in dealing with residential, social landlords and development matters. And this question is referring to the extraordinary government restrictions that have come in and impacted on the ability to continue construction activities, and looking at restrictions being re-invoked, as we've seen with Leicester recently. Jen, the question's just asking what sort of things can be done to mitigate risks for developers and contractors as we move forward in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Morning, everyone. There's quite a few things that we can all do really to consider that. As a few of the panelists have mentioned, communication throughout is really key. I mean, when lockdown hit, a number of our clients who are registered providers, it was a critical time for everyone, but March is an incredibly critical time for registered providers, as lockdown happened a week before the Homes England grant deadline. So that we learned quite a lot from that. And clearly it's important to adapt on and off-site processes and procedures to ensure that you are legally protected. So you can do a number of things like perhaps revisit projects, consider negotiations and do the actually cover if there was a recurrence. You can outline clear heads of terms if you're still in negotiation stages. You can, one of the things that we saw which caused a number of our clients difficulties was the sign and sealing process. A number of registered providers still use a seal which requires a physical signature. Now, Land Registry did issue some guidance in terms of electronically dealing with this, but it didn't really assist with witnessing requirements at all. And that was still required physically, despite the availability of things like this, Zoom, Teams, etc. In the short term, we came up with a number of options to get things over that line within a week period. But really going forward, it's perhaps looking at your governance rules to future-proof them, to enable execution of documents should there be further restrictions. Other elements to look at is perhaps looking at flexibility of the contract. So one example is perhaps looking at the tenure, if there's any restrictions on tenure in planning or in the title documentation, looking at making sure that you've got the flexibility to flip. So say perhaps, it restricts you to shared ownership sales, looking to flip back to rent if you needed to, just to make sure the properties aren't empty if people are having difficulty obtaining mortgage finance. Again, my colleagues have mentioned looking into supply chains and protecting you against that. In terms of sales, for new build properties, sales did continue to go through, and again, communication was really key in that. And the guidance allowed them to go ahead subject to the rules being followed. So where we've not exchanged contracts, documentation was amended to, to provide for that and enable the transaction to go ahead within the guidance. Where we had already exchanged, again, it's discussing with the other side and coming up with a reasonable way forward. At the end of the day, everybody wants the same outcome in that situation. So that was quite important there. And therefore, going forward on future projects, that's something that should be incorporated into all contractual documentation. And another point really is, as well as having to comply with regulatory requirements and health and safety, which I know my employment and insurance colleagues will be able to explain much more about that. In development contracts, it's important to be considering reputation on these. Especially with social media going a bit crazy with people taking pictures of sites and people not social distancing, etc. It's important to make sure that everybody's protected from all angles going forward as well.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jem. Thank you. That covers that off perfectly. And I've got one final question that's come in. We've got 10 minutes left of the session, so I'm sure we can cover this one off. If anybody does have any final questions, please do stick them in the Q&A section or the chat box. But just to finish off with the last question, one that I think will be one that Matthew Jones can answer for us. Matthew's a senior associate at Forbes Solicitors, specialising in commercial property, acting for private developers, dealing with development work. And this is a question, a very positive one really, seeing that the recent increase in new build sales. And Matt, we just wondered what your experience has been at the moment and what sort of trends you're seeing in the market.
Yeah, thanks, Ad. Yeah, we've seen a real positive bounce back on the sales fronts. We experienced for obvious reasons in April, back end of March and April, a real cliff edge drop off from our sales, and my team principally deal with the private sales of private developers, the sales of private developers, and that plot sale team was in communication with the sales teams. There was the challenges they were experiencing were as we've heard time and time again, unprecedented. But there seems to have been a real uptick in May and June, and we're actually seeing about as many plot sales, new instructions as we were at the end of last year and towards the kind of better months of last year. So it's been a real positive surge. It seems to be driven principally by buyers with larger deposits. Maybe the money is not being spent elsewhere. There's nowhere to spend it, or there was nowhere to spend it. So holidays have been pushed back. So it may be down to that. There's a real motivated sales teams from the clients that we've got, real motivated sales teams really pushing on with those. Obviously, new build developers can offer incentives that the second-hand market generally tend to not be able to. There is we have seen challenges with that where there's been chains, so there's been a bit of a conflict between the driving force of our client sales teams and the difficulties that are being experienced within the sort of second or third tier of the chain. So there's been real challenges there, and to touch back on what Jen said there with the reputations, I think my clients are just as sensitive to their reputations, and they've had to tread very carefully with that. Obviously, they've got their sales targets to meet, and yet and so have to drive those sales as hesitate to use the word aggressively, but as passionately as possible, but still mindful of the challenges that are experienced in the rest of the chain and people's personal circumstances, whether it's work or whatever it might be, or just simply the inability to go into a property to view it because of the COVID restrictions. Obviously, that's now seeing a bit of a change, and we're seeing a relaxation generally. So that's but I think that's been a real challenge for my clients as well. I think going forward, this just takes the question on, I think, a little bit, but just going forward, I think we're going to see a real continue to see a real fluctuation in the market. And at the moment, things are buoyant, but we've got on the other side, and to sort of temper that a little bit, we've got the difficulties that the high street are experiencing, hospitality sector, of course, redundancies. Those are really going to impact on the wider economy and ultimately on the housing market. So there are those challenges that are going to come into play. Again, that to counter that, the government are doing certain things, certain issues that are being put in place to ameliorate those challenges a little bit. We've got the community infrastructure, the new draft regulations surrounding the community infrastructure, which will hopefully provide some sort of flexibility in the community infrastructure payments. There's talk about a stamp duty cash flow that's not been announced yet, but that's been leaked that there might be they might be doing some sort of holiday with the cash flow, with the stamp duty rather. And then there's planning and bill, the planning and business bill that's currently going through Parliament as well, that will assist with current planning permissions that are currently being looked at, extending licensing requirements and a bit of licensing flexibility, and allowing planning that is being granted a longer extension period before it expires. So there's lots of positive things, and I think the government will go a long way towards supporting the housing market generally and supporting those things. But optimism with a note of caution, I would say.
Thanks, Matt. That's great. You mentioned the Chancellor's statement that's expected tomorrow, and the stamp duty holiday. It will be interesting to see what comes of that in particular. Whilst I think it will drive the market in the future, if as we're led to believe, the provisions will only come into force in October time, it will be interesting to see whether or not that slows down the market at the moment whilst people await the stamp duty holiday to kick in. But it's only leaks and rumours at the moment, so we will watch that announcement tomorrow with anticipation, and no doubt we'll follow up with information on that. Well, we've got a couple of minutes to spare, so that just gives me enough time to say thank you to everybody for attending today. Thank you to the panellists, both from Forbes Solicitors and MHA Moore and Smalley. Really informative, detailed answers that really covered off a lot of different areas, and I'm sure that has been of great use to the attendees on the call. Just wanted to say that we have been recording this session, and we will be sharing it through various platforms such as YouTube, our website, through social media, so that will be there for other people to see and gain that knowledge from. If anybody does have any questions that they want to follow up with any of the panel members, please send them through the usual channels. Give us a call, an email. You'll find us on LinkedIn, through our website. You'll soon be able to find us. So if you've got any questions whatsoever that you'd like to follow up with, we'd be very, very happy to receive them. So just call to me now to say thank you one more time, and that brings an end to our live Q&A session today. Thank you, everybody.